Welcome to the For Love and Money podcast, the show where business and social purpose meet to inspire a movement for positive change. Here's your host, Carolyn Butler-Madden.
In this episode of the For Love and Money podcast, I'm joined by Dr David Cooke, Executive Director of ESG Advisory, author of the book Kind Business, How Values Create Value, and Adjunct Professor at the UTS Business School. David's had a remarkable career spanning more than 35 years in the corporate world, including senior roles at Xerox, Canon, and as Managing Director and Chair for Australia and New Zealand at Konica Minolta, where he became the first non-Japanese leader in the company's history. In this conversation, David shares how he transformed Konica Minolta into a company that truly cares, one that embedded purpose, kindness, and human rights advocacy into its culture and operations. He tells powerful stories of how that shift not only inspired employees but also drove commercial success, with clients choosing them not just for product or price, but for who they were as a business. We also explore why leadership is about the shadow we cast, what it means to build a kind business in today's world, and how leaders can navigate the tension between doing good and delivering profit. This is an inspiring, deeply human conversation about authenticity, courage, and the power of values to create real value. Here's my interview with Dr. David Cooke. Dr. David Cooke, welcome to the For Love and Money podcast.
Lovely to be here with you.
Thank you. So, as you know, this podcast explores the intersection of profit and purpose. So let me start where I always start. Do you believe, David, if there's a role for love in business?
Short answer is yes, I absolutely do. I mean, the reason for that is that at the end of the day, I think we all understand that business is really about people. It's about the people who work there. It's about the people who buy the goods and services of the business. It's about the people who invest in companies, suppliers. There's a whole ecosphere, if you like, of stakeholders out there that all involve people. And absolutely the best way to treat all of those people is with love. If you don't care for all of the people in your business's ecosphere, then you won't have a thriving business in the long term. It'll just be a transactional business, and I would argue it won't survive very long.
Yeah, especially as we move into a future where people are becoming more considered about, what businesses they support, customers and consumers and younger people, considering the future they're facing. So yes, people. It's all about people. And yeah, if you don't love your fellow man and woman, what is there? So thank you for that. So I'm really curious to learn about your background, David, and the key moments that have brought you to where you are now, but including the key moments that brought you to where you were heading up Konica Minolta in Australia and taking the position you did, which I hope you will be going into.
Yeah, very happy to, because certainly my appointment as the Managing Director of Konica Minolta was a very, very key moment for me, and I think arguably the company, and I'll cover their trajectory in a moment. But for those who aren't familiar with Konica Minolta, it's not the strongest brand in its space, but it's a global Japanese company. It's existed for about 150 years. In IT terms, it's in the imaging sector. So Konica Minolta globally produce document managing systems, scanners, printers, and also medical imaging. So anything that captures an image. And so in the document and business area, the main competitors, which everybody would know, are their Xerox, their HP, their Canon, and so on. Now, in Australia, Konica Minolta for 40 years had been run by Japanese people. That the managing director would be sent from Tokyo. They'd be on typically a 4-year visa, and they'd be replaced with another Japanese person at the end of that time. But at a certain point after 40 years, something very strange happened, and that is that I was appointed as the first non-Japanese managing director of Konica Minolta. And in fact, at that time, was the first person in the Konica Minolta world globally to report straight to Tokyo and not through any kind of, layered system of an Asian president or anything like that. Now, on that particular day, it was announced at a conference. I was the only one in the room other than the people who'd flown out from Tokyo who knew. It was announced. I was invited up on stage, and I turned to the audience. There were about 300 people, and I said, I want us all to work together to build a company that cares about the people who work here, that cares about our customers, and that cares about our community. Now, the next day, I walked into work for the first time as the new managing director. I'd previously been the general manager and head of sales. And of course, that's where the rubber hit the road. It's all very well to have a vision statement, but that's just the starting point. So I wrote to everybody in the company on day one, and I said, look, unfortunately, you couldn't all be at the conference, but you probably know by now this is what was announced. But this is what I said. This was my vision statement. There's only one problem. I don't actually know how to achieve it, and I need your help. Now, that in itself, in the first 24 hours of being the new managing director, was a massive pivot culturally. Because in Japanese culture, when you get appointed into the most senior role, you're kind of supposed to be all-knowing. You sit at the top of that org chart. Everybody pays deference to you. Nobody would ever question anything you said. And it's a hierarchical, respectful system. But what I'd done is I'd come out and I said on day one that I don't know how to do one of the key strategies that I want to implement. So I showed vulnerability and maybe to some degree some humility. And I said to everybody, I need all of your ideas. I want you to buy into this, but I need you to tell me what's got to change in this company. What aren't we getting right? What do we need to do more of? What do we need to do less of? And we used a survey tool from a small company called Market Culture. They have a tool called the Market Responsiveness Index, the MRI, sent that out to everybody in the company, and we got something like a 95% response rate to a volume survey, which if you've ever done surveys, you'll know that's off the Richter scale. And as well as Likert scales, like, is Konica Minolta a good company to work at? No, it's not. It's not bad. It's the fantastic, those sort of little measuring tools that are used in statistics. Apart from those, we had free text fields. Now, it was a 400-person company at the time. It was 500 when I left. And we got 800 ideas back on things we could do to improve the company. So there I am, early stage managing director, never run a complete company before. And now this was just gold. I had these gold nuggets of ideas. And what was really starting to change culturally is that instead of everything being top down in a hierarchical system, the ideas as to what we were going to do as a company came percolating up. And then when we implemented things, I could say to people, we're going to do this, this, and this over the next couple of months. And just to remind you, they were your ideas. We did listen and we're implementing because some of these ideas are fantastic and so on. Now, just to talk a little bit about, I guess, what's the link between that approach to running a company and the whole discussion of profit and purpose. And what happened is that the majority, we could group those ideas into categories, and the number one thing people wanted was better communication from top down and between departments and so on. It was low-hanging fruit. Communication was poor, and it wasn't that hard to fix, to be honest. The next most requested category was people wanted more purpose. We didn't have a CSR program. This is 2013. We were way behind most other companies. So they wanted charity partnerships and they wanted volunteering days off and salary match giving. They wanted us to make a contribution to the community. And so we started to implement those kinds of things. And we actually moved beyond what I would call fairly standard corporate social responsibility initiatives And we ended up moving into a whole area of human rights advocacy, which I think was more cutting edge than necessarily, supporting charity partners. And it came about because we had a conference in Cambodia and we needed a keynote speaker, and a woman was recommended to me who had been trafficked into the brothel systems of Cambodia when she was a very young teenager. She had got out of that system. She'd married a French man, moved to Paris, and said, my life's just unbelievable now, but I can't stay here. Convinced him, he was from Médecins Sans Frontières, so probably a pretty good guy, convinced him to go back, and they started an NGO, non-government organization, to rescue, rehabilitate, and reintegrate young women who were in the same situation as her. So we really had a broad portfolio of the work we were doing. Now, we did that because it was just the right thing to do to support them. We supported them through educational scholarships. Some of those young women who'd been deeply traumatized actually sat university entrance exams. 7 of them qualified, but there were just no funds in a small charity for them to go. So we made sure they went to uni and kids went to high school and so on. Now, interestingly, a short while after that, I asked everybody in the company who'd worked there for 25 years or more to come to Sydney. And I said, I want to take you out to dinner as a group. Thank you for your loyalty to the company. They'd been there a lot longer than me. And we did that just in a cheap and cheerful restaurant, no private dining room or anything. And at the end of a meal that lasted a couple of hours, one man said, could I please say something? Now, interestingly, every one of the people who were stayers, 25 years or more, some were 35, they were all field service engineers. So, when you're printing to your multifunction device and it jams or whatever, you can't get it to work, you kick it, still doesn't work, you ring up the 13 number, somebody runs in with a branded uniform, those people. There were about a dozen of them. And this man stood up, and the interesting thing is that he hadn't said a word all night. Very quiet man, and he stood up in a public restaurant and he made what I imagine was the first speech he'd ever made in his life. And what he said was, I've worked here for more than 25 years. That's why you invited me tonight. And for that entire time, I never told anybody where I worked. I just didn't see the point. It was just a job I went to do a fair day's work for a fair day's pay. And that's how I fed my family. And he said, but now I tell every single person I meet that I work for Konica Minolta. And why would I do that? I do that because I feel so proud to work for an organization that would care about young women on the other side of the world who've been trafficked into a life of sexual slavery. And it wasn't until that moment that I really understood the impact of a company seeking to be a good company and do good things. We did it because it was just the right thing to do. But all of a sudden, I realized that it was having a massive impact on the people who worked with us. Now, that's kind of the purpose piece. Okay, where's the profit piece? And that's another short story, if I may tell it. And that is that we just started to win all of these big contracts, big national contracts. And we typically, through the tender process, were not very successful with the very big companies. They just went with what they thought was a safe bet. And I mentioned some of those brand names earlier. But then we started to win their business. And I would always go to those companies and I'd say to them, thank you very much for making us your technology partner. We think you've made a very wise decision because we think we're a good company and we'll fulfill the contract well, we believe. But can you please tell me, how did you make that decision? Because for 40 years, you've never spent $1 with us. I'm just intrigued. That also the same thing, but one man in particular, I thought summed it up beautifully. He said, look, we would always assess these tenders in the procurement department basically on 3 criteria: the product, the price, and the service levels. And in your industry, you're pretty much all the same. And so we just stick with our current supplier. But we're obliged to go to market every 4 years according to our governance processes. So we do. He said, but now our governance has tightened up and we're being asked to also assess not just what it is you're trying to sell us, but to assess who you are. I thought it was a beautiful statement. And he used the analogy of a car. He said, we don't just look at the bright new shiny cars that you all have anymore. We lift up the bonnet and we have a look inside. And he said, when we looked inside your company, we saw differences. He said, you're all fine. But he said, we saw big differences with Konica Minolta in terms of the initiatives you put in place for your people, but also the contribution you're making in community, particularly around your efforts to end modern slavery. We've done a lot of work in our supply chain, but also the kids in Cambodia who were slaves up until, they were rescued. And this particular guy said, we realize that your values and our values align, and we're a really good fit for each other. And that's why we've awarded you this contract. And some of those contracts over their period were worth millions of dollars to us. But we won them because we were just trying to be a good company, and it was recognized.
Wow. Okay, I have so many questions for you. I don't know where to start. But that's a brilliant picture of what you created at Konica Minolta. I want to go back just to get some understanding. You said you were the first non-Japanese leader who was appointed as managing director of the region. What changed? Why was that? Do you know?
Yeah, look, pretty much. The guy who made those appointments as to who ran each country was the second most senior person in the organization. The president sat at the top of all functions. And this man was number two. He was responsible for, all the sales and marketing, the revenue, the profit, and so on. Didn't really get involved in much of the head office stuff. The president had a secretariat and he had direct reports that did that. But this man had to drive the business in every country. He'd previously been the company's president of the US, so he had a bit of a Western bent to him. And he was a bit of a maverick. It's unusual in Japanese business circles. You don't get away with that too often. But I used to call him the rock star because he played in a rock band.
Oh, right. Okay.
It was just different. And he said to me, I've decided to roll the dice and take a gamble on you. And I said to him, I've been in the industry for whatever it was then, 22 years. I've worked for Xerox. I've worked for Canon in, reasonably senior management roles. I've got a huge amount of knowledge about this local market, about local people, about customers and their preferences and so on. I don't actually think it's much of a gamble. But what he was alluding to was that he had to justify that further up the food chain. And that's where he was taking a gamble.
Absolutely.
And that's how it happened.
Absolutely. But, you must have really impressed him for him to do that. Which brings me to the second question, which is, you'd been there for a while, heading up sales and marketing. You'd been in, the corporate world for a while before then. What was the turning point that actually made you start reimagining business through this human lens, like showing up, actually, standing up and saying what you did, that you wanted to build a company that cares, and then actually speaking to your people and showing vulnerability by saying you didn't know how to achieve it? That's a departure from the normal corporate world, and as you said, very un-Japanese corporate world as well. How did you get there?
Well, I reimagined the business because now I was in complete control of that business. And Tokyo gave me a lot of license. I didn't reimagine myself. That's just always how I conducted business. So when I was a salesperson, which is, how I entered the corporate world, there were times when I'd sit down and try and assess a company's needs as to whether we might have a product that fitted their business or not. And sometimes it was talking to, very big printing companies about big digital presses and things like that. They're very technical. Not that I'm a technical person, and sometimes I'd come to the conclusion that, you know what, I don't think we've quite got the right product for you. And I'd recommend who did.
Mm.
Or they'd be 3 years into a 4-year lease. And I'd say, why are you looking at upgrading? Because you're going to have to pay out 25% of the lease. And they'd say, well, we're just aware that, technology's moved a bit and we just want to stay up to date. And I would sometimes come to the conclusion, my advice is don't pay out that lease. The advances are not that great that it warrants doing that. And if you do take my advice, would I be able to come back in 9 months and have this conversation again? And people would buy product from me because I was the only person who didn't try and sell them a product.
It's about trust.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about is honest leadership,
Mm.
which, we're in pretty short shrift of these days, but that is what builds trust, and trust is the currency of success. And it absolutely stuns me that so many leaders don't seem to understand that, or they say they understand, but they behave in a way that's contradictory to that.
Yes, it's true. And it does. I don't have any real answers because a lot of those people are loving partners, loving parents, great neighbors, coach the kids' soccer team or netball team on a Saturday morning, all that kind of stuff. Good people. Somehow when they walk through the door of a business in the morning, they feel they've got to switch into a certain mood. And it's a fundamental misunderstanding.
Mm. And it must be at least partly caused by, the belief for the last 40, 50 years that the purpose of business is to create shareholder returns and everything else will flow from that. But it is about profit, profit, profit. So, you doing what you just explained that you did to that customer flies in the face of how most people would behave.
Yes, and it's short-termism versus long-termism.
Uh-huh.
Try and make a sale today versus postpone it. Make a sale when it's the right time to make the sale for that customer, and you still get the sale.
Hmm.
And if you do it the other way, you're just in this massive half a dozen people who are throwing quotes at them.
Yeah.
You're no different.
Yeah.
I it's not even that I saw merit strategically in being different. I just wasn't really prepared to be anybody other than who I was when I was in business.
And that's the third thing, that when you talked about that client saying to you, it comes down to who you are, because when we evaluate you all, we look at product, price, service, and you're all pretty much equal footing across that. But who you are, and that's who you were as a leader, showing up as David Cooke.
Mm.
And that who piece, I think that regular listeners to this podcast will know I talk a lot about who, start with who, identity, and you can't connect to a meaningful purpose unless it connects to who you are, because purpose isn't powerful unless it's personal.
Mm.
And that comes from really connecting it to what's important to you. But that who piece is, I think you kind of underplay that, but I think I think it shows real courage for a leader to show up wholly as themselves. So congratulations.
Well, thank you. I actually think it would have been, maybe it's courage, but it would have been harder for me to do the opposite than to do what came naturally to me.
Yeah.
So I never saw it as courage. I just saw it as being authentic, I suppose.
Yep. Yep. So, David, I'd love to know did you have challenges in implementing this approach in a company whose headquarters is in another country? Because I often hear from leaders, yes, but our head office is in the US or Japan or Europe or whatever. So we're very limited as to, what we can do culturally within the organization. Did you have that challenge?
Yes, I did. I had 3 different bosses over the 8 years that I was the managing director, because they'd moved people around into different roles, people get promoted and so on and so on. And or being, given special projects and things. But look, at the end of the day, well, I'll give you an example. One of my bosses said to me, first meeting with him, okay, I've just been given the job that the previous guy had. I'm now your boss. And, they kind of all knew me up there, and they'd probably get handed a file, there's, whatever. And he just cut straight to the chase. He said, look, you just got to stop doing all that stuff that you do.
Oh, really?
What sort of stuff? You know what I'm talking about, David, corporate social responsibility stuff and gender equality and all that focus on those things, And because we put in, sort of 12 weeks of parental leave for the non-birthing parent. We put in 2 weeks of domestic violence leave and counselling for abusers who were, committing domestic violence, all this discretionary stuff. And that's what he saw. Stop all that stuff. And anyway, I could see that I wasn't going to get very far with him. He'd just been waiting to have this conversation with me.
Mm.
And so I said to him, look, I have enormous respect for you. You're a global business leader and one of the most senior people in our company. And at the end of the day, you're my boss. And I should be respectful and do what you tell me to do. And I will go back and I'll dismantle those programs if that's what you really want me to do. But I ask one thing in return. If, as I suspect, the business financially starts going backwards, we lose the market share that we've gained, the revenue drops, the profit drops, people start leaving, the best and brightest in the industry don't want to come and work for us anymore. If all of those things happen, I just want you to go over to that lift. He was on level 14. The president had a floor on level 15. I said, press the button, and when the lift doors open, press 15. Go up and tell the president it was your idea.
Whoa! I got goosebumps. That's amazing. What happened?
He waved his arm and he just sent me away, and he never raised it again. Now,
Oh my God. I love that. I love that.
Well, I've reflected on, I had a few moments like that, cultural differences and things. And arguably that was me being rude. But at the same time, I spoke quietly, professionally, gently. I said I would do what he told me to do. I just asked one thing in return. That was all. And he didn't want to do it.
Wow. And so had he not connected the dots between the success that was coming out of the company and, the different approach that you were taking?
Well, I could say not at all. Yet at the same time, the proof would appear to be that when I said, I think it'll go backwards financially, and he didn't want to take that chance, somewhere in his subconscious, he must have thought, I don't believe in this stuff, but maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
And he had bigger fish to fry. So he moved on to, America and Europe and pushing into the Chinese market, the Indian market. He'd probably just decided it's just not worthwhile.
Yeah. Yeah. Good on you, though, for taking that stand.
Enjoying the podcast? If you're looking for more inspiration, head to our website, thecauseeffect.com.au, for more resources on how you can start using your business as a force for good. Or buy the For Love and Money book. Every copy sold allows us to protect 1 square metre of rainforest.
So you've talked about the profitability, so connecting, a caring, kind, purposeful culture to commercial success. But within that, in the middle, can you highlight, what changed most tangibly in the culture or in employee engagement? Could you see, or did it just sort of all meld into one?
No, you could have cut the air with a knife. Yeah, people would walk through the front door and say, it just feels different. And it
Yeah.
did feel different. And, some of the old-fashioned stuff too, real 101, like management by walking about. I'd walk around the building, I got rid of it took a while, but I got rid of offices for managers, and we would open plan, and, I'd try and remember as many people's personal circumstances as possible, How did Johnny go, with football on Saturday morning, just all that connecting kind of stuff, which people super appreciated, and yeah, it was tangible, it was palpable.
Wonderful. And if you had to name one internal lever that made the biggest difference, do you think it was leadership mindset? Do you think it was the NGOs you were supporting, storytelling, metrics?
Uh, yeah, arguably storytelling, because sometimes not everybody was a part of a particular initiative. And so you kind of had to tell the story for everybody to understand. And look, there was, when we started to push heavily into human rights advocacy, and we were advocating with the Australian government, this would have been 2016, 2017, so I'm about 3 years in. We were advocating for an Australian Modern Slavery Act.
Mm,
It would compel every large company in Australia to report to the government via the Attorney General's Department what they were doing to eliminate forced labour and modern slavery from their supply chains. So every company in Australia used stuff in their business, and that stuff had to be made somewhere, and it typically is not Australia. Uniforms for staff, laptops, office furniture, all that stuff. So it gets made by another company overseas. And in those supply chains, in those factories, those other companies' factories, there were human rights abuses. And sometimes it wouldn't even be in that factory. Sometimes it would be in the component manufacturers. So if you can imagine how many different companies make a bit that goes into an iPhone,
yeah.
it's massive, and it's across different countries and regions and all that kind of stuff. But in those supply chains that flow into those Australian companies, significant human rights abuses. So very, very poor, vulnerable people are either sold into slavery, or they're coerced, or they're tricked. Sign this contract, we'll give you a great job in a beautiful air-conditioned factory in a large city. You'll be able to support your family for the rest of their lives by just coming and working for 1 or 2 years, Oh my God, particularly after disasters. These labour hire companies trawl through places where there have been floods and earthquakes and so on, signing people up. And of course, it's a giant trick. They get there, and it's nothing like what they expect. They're told that they have massive debts to the company, which might account for half of their wage. They're told that the company they're working for will charge them the other half for the accommodation and the meals that they're giving them, and they're being asked to work for zero, and they're just devastated. So we wanted to take a stance against this, and we felt that the Australian Modern Slavery Act, which would compel companies to report to the government, what are you doing to get rid of this? A good way to do it. And one of the catalysts for that, and I loved telling this story to our people, and it was a big kind of cultural contributor, I guess, is we're on another one of these overseas conferences. This time it was in Thailand, and these were sort of annual end-of-year awards presentations for the top performers and so on. It's like an incentive reward for them. And one night we were on an old clipper ship, an old sailing ship, and for a gala dinner. And at the end of the meal, there was an opportunity to hear a talk from the cruise director, I guess you'd call them, about Thai culture and Thai cuisine and things like that. and it was held in the ship's library. Now, I have to be absolutely upfront and say I did not go to that talk. Fortunately, my daughter was attending it with me. You know, people could take their partners. My daughter came, one of my daughters. And the next morning, Nina said to me, "Dad, you really should have gone to the talk in the library." I said, "Oh, yeah?" She said, "Yeah, it was about slavery." Because she knew we'd started to move down this path in Konica Minolta, down the anti-slavery path. And she said, when they went to Q&A, the first question from the audience was, we're in the middle of the ocean. It's pitch black out here. You can't see a thing, except there are lights dotted all around us in the ocean. What are the lights? And the woman said, "Oh, it's interesting you should ask that question. Every light is a Thai fishing boat, and they shine the light into the water, and that attracts the fish. That's how they all fish." And she said, "What's interesting about the question is that just last week, during the day, we went out in a little dinghy, pulled up at one of these fishing boats, explained to the captain that we run tourist tours and things. Could we come on board and ask about the sort of fish they catch and, you know, life at sea and all of that?" And he said, "Sure." And this woman stepped on board, and the first thing she saw was the emaciated figure of a man sitting on the deck of the boat, had a collar around his neck, and the collar was chained to the deck of the boat. And the woman, in shock almost, said, "Who's that?" And the captain looked down and he said, "Oh, it's a slave." And she said, "But you can't have slaves." And with a sweep of his arm indicating all the other boats, and it's thought there's about 50,000 fish those waters off the coast of the Asian countries, he said, "Most of us have slaves."
Wow.
Then she said, "But why is he tied up?" And the response was, "Oh, this one's a troublemaker, but not for much longer. It'll be fish food soon."
Oh, my
So they're
God.
about to murder him by throwing him overboard.
Oh, my God.
So then the guy said, "If you're so concerned about it," so he kept referring to the human being as it, not him, "you can buy it off me if you want to." They negotiated a price, $500 US. She went back to the ship, spoke to the captain. He got money out of the safe, and they bought that human being, and they went ashore to a police station, and they set that man free. He'd come from Myanmar. He'd been promised a great job in Bangkok in a lovely factory, but he'd been sold at the docks as a slave. Never saw a factory, and what she would not have been able to realize, or probably wasn't that relevant, was that captain would have paid no more than $100 US at the docks. So he'd made a good profit. So you can buy a human being to work for you for the rest of their life until they collapse and die for $100. And very rigorous research tells us now there are something like 50 million people trapped in modern slavery. So when I came back, and I said to everybody in Konica Minolta, I used to routinely go around branches for monthly updates and things, and I would tell this story. And I said my light bulb moment was, if seafood caught by slaves can find its way into the supply chains of the biggest food companies in the world, and into our restaurants and into our supermarkets and into the Sydney fish market, then what products or services made by slavery might be finding their way into our company? Could it be the products our parent makes? Turns out no, but components that go to a Konica Minolta factory, yes. And so I said to everybody, I hope you'll join me in doing whatever we can to advocate for these vulnerable and voiceless people. Once people are all on that same page with a cause, they're still doing their jobs, but there's something that's just been woven into the fabric of what they do every day, then, it just moves mountains.
Doesn't it? Doesn't it? And that's, people want to feel like they're engaged in meaningful work. And
Yes.
what you're talking about is exactly that. And it always makes me think, how much potential are we leaving on the table? So much.
100%. Yes. Why isn't this the norm everywhere? Everybody wins.
And you can see it with companies who do business like this, is they outperform their competitors.
Yeah.
So why hasn't it become the standard? David, why hasn't it become the standard?
Well, because people just default to a short-term mentality. And I've got some notes here. Let me see if I can find the actual quote from Milton Friedman.
Yep.
So you may be familiar with him, and listeners may be. So he's a Nobel Prize-winning economist who wrote a defining article in 1971 published in the New York Times. Now, basically in that article, and I don't think I have this in my notes, but what he said was the one and only social responsibility of a business is to generate profit. Real simple. So what people interpreted that to mean was don't get distracted by the noise. And in this era, as opposed to necessarily 1970, that noise would be seen as being ESG, environmental social governance initiatives. It would be seen as DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Don't worry about any of that stuff. It's just noise. Just stick to the knitting and generate profit. Now, that statement in 1971 was seized upon by the captains of industry, people like Jack Welch, who was the most famous CEO at the time. He ran General Electric. I think at that point was the biggest company in the world. They're an aeronautical engineering company, owned Boeing and so on. And he just went hard on that mantra of just cut to the chase, short term, derive profits, make the shareholders happy. But the way he did it was to devastate entire swathes of the United States. Entire towns, virtually states, were devastated as he moved all the manufacturing offshore because it was cheaper. You make more that way. So hundreds of thousands of people probably ultimately lost jobs, and then there were the component manufacturers that supplied the factories don't need you anymore. Small businesses, shops would close down, et cetera, et cetera. But hey, he was hailed for probably 2 decades as the greatest CEO in the world. Now, the interesting thing is, and I really like this, and I will sort of refer to notes here because I'll get the stats right. McKinsey Consulting, who many people will have heard of, they wanted to answer the question, we can see that short-termism will have devastating effects at times in the community. So the only winners are the people who are wealthy enough to own shares in those companies. But might there actually be longer term a negative impact on the company itself pursuing that agenda? And this is what they did. They undertook research which was into the consequences of short-term thinking. And it was called the McKinsey Longevity Report. And it's fascinating. They looked back to 1958 to the 500 companies sitting on the big US stock exchange, the Standard & Poor's, the S&P 500 at that time in that year. And they had a look at what their average lifespan was. So how long had they been around? And on average, they'd existed for 61 years. They then had a look at the year of the research, 2023, to see, the new set of, in some cases, companies in the 500, how long on average have those companies been around for? And they found that the lifespan of the company was now less than 18 years. Companies were disappearing at a rapid rate. And then they extrapolated out, well, what will the S&P 500 look like in 2027? And they determined that 75% of the companies on the US exchange today, 2023, will no longer even exist because businesses just got it wrong. And they don't realize it. It's as if capitalism is eating itself. Surge to generate as much profit for the shareholder as possible before the next AGM is actually sowing the seeds of the company's own destruction, and they can't even see it. Now, the fascinating thing for me is looping back to Milton Friedman, who in a funny kind of way started all of this. is that in that same article, 1971, so this isn't with the vision of hindsight, in the very same article, but people chose not to read it or not to think about it or whatever, put their head in the sand. Friedman said, and this is short-termism versus long-termism. Friedman said, it may well be in the long-term interests of a corporation to devote resources to providing amenities to its community or to improving its government even. That may make it easier to attract desirable employees. It may reduce the wages bill and have other desirable effects for the company. And Jack Welch, who ran with the short-term mantra for decades, when he retired, he looked back, and it was just post the global financial crisis. He looked back with the wisdom of hindsight on how he'd conducted his career. And his quote is, "A focus purely on maximizing shareholder value is the dumbest idea in the world."
Oh,
So the two greatest proponents
wow.
have a different view of how business should be conducted.
Wow. That's so interesting. I have not heard that part of the article that you just read out.
Nobody ever talks about that part. I didn't know. I just knew the famous Friedman quote.
Yeah.
I asked somebody, a colleague who has an M&A advisory business in New York called Pottinger, if he would kindly write a testimonial for the book. He'd read the manuscript, and the two founders both wrote very nice testimonials. And he sent me something, and he said, "Will this be okay, David?" And then he said, "By the way, you might want to include something in the latter part of that Friedman article." And he sent me the quote.
Wow. That's
Yes.
so interesting.
I went, wow, too.
People just cherry pick what works for them, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Have you heard of, he's the emeritus professor at Oxford University's Business School, Professor Colin Mayer?
Yes, yes.
And have you heard his definition of the purpose of business?
Not the exact definition, some
Let me-
familiarity with his work, but can you recall it?
Let me see if I can get it right. I
Yeah.
might stumble on the words, but the purpose of business is not to profit. Sorry, the purpose of business is to create profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet, not to
Yeah.
profit from
Yeah.
creating problems.
Yes, and I think you could add, that's beautiful. You know, that's business or economic wisdom, if you like. But as we were discussing earlier, when we talked about why doesn't everybody do this, there's no losers. We looked at the McKinsey study. We know how loss can occur, but people used to see profit and purpose as competitors. They saw them at opposite ends of a spectrum. What people are starting to understand, with the aid of thinkers like that, is that it's not a linear spectrum. It's basically a virtuous circle. The more profit you can make, the more good you can do in society. The more good you do in society, the more profit you make. And people come and work for you. People want to buy your products and services, and it just keeps going around. And it's kind of a beautiful thing once you get it happening.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you've said that leadership is about the shadow we cast. I wonder if you can expand on this a little bit and also share how can leaders today be more conscious of the shadow that they're creating?
Well, yeah, I mean, the concept of shadow is that as you become more senior, you typically become more influential, or you can be more influential. Now, just picking up on the word leadership for a moment, I don't actually ascribe that term to somebody because they sit at the top of an org chart. They just happen to occupy the most senior position, but I only call somebody a leader if they show leadership qualities. But if you are a leader, you I don't want to wax too lyrical, but people will notice your good qualities and your good traits, your good characteristics. And most people have those inside themselves anyway. But if you don't have a leader who models those and gives by default you permission to be like that and to model those in your own life, let them out, in other words, then they just get stifled. People won't feel, the current term in business is, they won't feel psychologically safe.
Mm.
And one of the great things about when people do feel psychologically safe to speak up, then they will challenge the leader from time to time. And that's just a blessing, because you don't get it right all the time.
Yeah.
And, you know, sometimes I'd be walking down the corridor, I'd be in the coffee queue, I'd be getting in the lift to go home or something. And, you know, somebody'd say to me, look, I love working in the company. Gosh, it's changed so much. But you know what? I'm not quite sure that we're really paying enough attention to this or that or whatever, They felt comfortable.
Mm. And that's a gift, as you say.
Yeah, thank you for the golden nugget. I think you're right. It's just not something that got onto my radar.
Yeah.
Just all the time. So that's kind of your shadow, I think.
Mm.
But the concept is you can amplify your shadow by letting everybody else have their authentic shadow.
I love that. I love that. I'm going to squeeze in a couple of other questions if I can. We're running out of time, but this has been such a fascinating conversation. Now, I'm thinking of Unilever and the work that Paul Polman did, followed by Alan Jope, and where Unilever now, after pushback from investors. You left Konica Minolta in 2020. You've now got your ESG advisory service. Has the work you did at Konica Minolta continued now that you've gone? Do you know?
Yes, I did a talk the other night, actually. You're aware, Carol and I wrote a book, Kind
Yes.
Business, Our Values Create Value. And a colleague wrote a book and asked me if I'd speak at the book launch, because they're on very aligned topics. And there were a couple of quite senior Konica Minolta people there who I hadn't seen for 5 years, and they came up and, we had a big hug and talked a bit. So I deliberately didn't, look at figures or anything, ASIC figures. You can get all that stuff, but I chose not to. And the short answer is a lot of the initiatives continued, but I was replaced with a Japanese person, and culturally it's just different. And largely their role is to do what their boss in Tokyo tells them to do. It's not a role where you're asked to think or show initiative or come up with new ideas yourself. That's not what that role is. So some stuff's been diluted,
Mm.
but it's a lot of has been embedded, and it's there. And one reason it gets embedded is you can change the person at the top, but we still had 500 people in that pyramid that really bought into all this stuff. And not every single person, some people didn't quite get it or whatever, but absolutely en masse wanted to work for that sort of company, wanted to contribute more to the purpose of the company and so on. So that's pretty unstoppable.
Yeah. Yeah. That has a material effect. It doesn't just disappear. And the ripple effect of beyond that business, like the future leaders who leave Konica Minolta and become, leaders of businesses elsewhere, it has an impact there as well.
Yes. And look, arguably the Paul Polman situation. So, he was the global CEO of Unilever for 10 years. And when he stepped away, I would say the momentum was there almost at that same level for a while, and probably has dissipated a little bit.
Mm.
And, we won't go into the whole history of that. But in my book, Kind Business, I mention lots of different case studies, but I would say the one I mention the most, or the person I mention the most with the most sort of respect and affection, if you like, is Paul Polman. And one question Paul Polman asked every CEO to ask themselves, which I just find so powerful, is he said, ask yourself, is the world a better place because my company is in it?
Mm.
Powerful question.
So powerful, yeah. And he he is an amazing leader, and he showed such leadership, incredible leadership at Unilever, and continues to. But I would say that you here in Australia locally, an amazing leader as well. And I'd love to give you the opportunity. Your book, Kind Business, can you give a bit of a summary to people about what that's about? Because you've talked about some of the concepts here, but I'd love listeners to be able to understand what they could get from it.
Oh, well, thank you for that opportunity and your very kind compliment. Look, the book is called Kind Business, and the subtitle is How Values Create Value. So kind business really, to a large degree, is the moral imperative for being kind, showing love in business, being honest, transparent, being a good business. The subtitle, How Values Create Value, is really the business case. So not everybody responds to the moral imperative. And if you had to do a pitch to a board with, crusty old chair who didn't get any of this stuff and came through a different era, loved Jack Welch's approach or whatever, and you had to pitch to them, I would pitch via what the ROI will be. I'd bring it back to, what are the main objectives of the company? Well, as you know, they're to hit this profit number. Okay, great. Let's talk about how we're going to get that number. And then you start talking about the financial returns of being a good business. And you talk about people want to work there, people will stay longer. People constantly come up to me and say, oh, David, got tapped on the shoulder by, ABC company the other day. I'm sure you know they pay more than we do. Yep, yeah. I used to work there myself, whatever. And but don't worry, David, I'm not going anywhere. I just love being a part of what we're doing. Or I had that multiple times. So there's a strong ROI. I gave you the example of us winning contracts for the first time ever. So there's a very strong business case for being a good business. So the book covers both. It covers the heart aspect, and it also covers the business case if you need it up your sleeve.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. And I'm sorry we didn't even get to the work you're doing today in your advisory business. So if people want to know more about what you're doing now, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Yes. So when I left Konica Minolta, stepped away from full-time corporate life, I did form a company called ESG Advisory, so Environmental, Social and Governance Advisory. I'm not an environmental expert. I can point people in that direction if they want me to. I'm not a governance expert. I'm not a lawyer, but I can point people in that direction. But I think my forte is around the S, because the S of ESG, social, is just about people. And most of the work I do is not classic consulting, as in come in and transform our company or whatever. But if somebody wanted to build a social impact program, sure, I can help them with that on site. But what I do a lot of is public speaking. So I get invited to speak at conferences, and also I run workshops. And it can be on those things like, having social impact, changing corporate culture, those sorts of things, how to build high-performing teams through, engagement. But one thing I do a lot of is ethical decision-making workshops. So you're a senior executive or you're a management team. How do you know what the right thing to do is? Complex world that we live in, and there are all sorts of ethical models around that. And I reach back to the great philosophers of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, because that wisdom is just as relevant today. And those workshops often are based on hypotheticals. Imagine you don't work in this company anymore. We're going to transport you into this, and all of a sudden you find yourself having to make this decision. What do you think you'd do? And why would you do that? Who else in the room would do that? And we get a lot of dialogue and discussion going around how to make more ethical decisions in the business world or the organizational world. So that's the kind of field I play in, and I enjoy it, and hopefully I make a contribution to other organizations.
I have no doubt that you would, especially with your experience. That's huge. David, thank you so much for your time, for your generosity in sharing your wisdom and your journey and your insights. I'm going to ask you, actually, first, before I ask you the final thing and to take the show out, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners?
Oh, look, probably I think the most loftiest aim that we could all aspire to achieving is freeing those 50 million people from slavery. And I talked about companies having ethical sourcing programs to diagnose the problems inside their supply chains, but every individual can make a difference as well. We all buy stuff.
Yeah.
We buy clothes, we buy, electronic goods and so on. And I would just request everybody to do as much due diligence as you can on where are those things made, whether people paid a living wage. And more and more you'll see companies putting that sort of information on their websites, usually in the sustainability tab. But if you just keep asking, you go to a department store and you pick up a garment and it's really cheap and you think, God, how do they do that? $3 back to school t-shirt. Go on up and ask the shop assistant, do you know where this was made? Has whatever I use brand names, whatever department store you're in, do your buyers actually check to make sure that people are paid a living wage and treated properly? Do you do that work? They'll say that, I don't know. But if enough people ask enough times, it gets back to head office and people see it. Oh, there's this groundswell of people asking now. We will sell more T-shirts if we go and find out. And if the answer isn't the answer that will sell more T-shirts, then we will start to implement programs with those factories. And we'll say to them, if you don't lift your game and no longer use forced labor and pay people properly and treat people properly, then you'll lose our contract. And they start to leverage the muscle they have, probably not for humanitarian reasons, for commercial reasons. I'm a pragmatic former corporate guy. I don't care why people do good stuff. I just want to
do it. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely agreed. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you to close the show out with a response to this question. So fast forward 5 years from now. In your wildest and your most wonderful dreams, what is your vision of what business could look like?
Well, if we loop right back to our opening minute of the podcast, we talked about love in business and how it should be embedded in business, why it makes sense to be embedded in business, because business is all about people. So, the landscape I'd like to see in business is businesses earning strong financial returns on the basis of treating people well, treating the people who work there well, being honest and transparent with their customers, not bullying their suppliers, but treating the suppliers well in their contract negotiations, and finding some space to contribute to the community and to society as well, and not having what is more common today, a blinkered attitude, which is, yeah, I know there's homelessness. Yes, I know there's, cancer, disease in society. Yes, I know there's all these bad things, but it's nothing to do with me. Government's supposed to sort that out. Charities are supposed to sort that out. Get rid of those blinkers and just say, hey, we're actually all a part of the same ecosphere. We're all on the same planet. We're all in this together. And, business is just has such massive resources, trillions of dollars worth of capital and some really smart people running these businesses and in these businesses. You turn just a fraction of that power that the corporate world has into doing good in society outside their businesses, and you can transform the world. I'd like to see the world looking like.
Wonderful. Dr. David Cooke, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the podcast, and it's just been lovely talking to you.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the For Love and Money podcast. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the purpose movement, visit us at thecauseeffect.com.au. And remember, doing good is good for business. So if you're not doing good, then what are you doing?